Hi folks, it's time for another one of my movies by the month. This time, it's August. Now, as you all know, I took the month of August off from making videos, apart from the movies by month episodes that I did, and it was a really good time, honestly. I needed that time away just to kind of decompress and relax and have some time just to chill out, watch shows, read books, go for nice walks up hills and play my Xbox and all those things without any guilt that I should have been making videos at the time. But as it turned out, I ended up watching an awful lot of stuff. So to mix it up, I'm going to tell you about a bunch of films that I saw, and I might do a separate video where I talk about some of the TV shows I do, or I might just do them as separate individual things. We'll see what happens with that. But for now, here are the movies. So let's get fired into August. Okay, so one of the first things I actually watched in August was a film I've been meaning to see for absolute ages, and that was A Quiet Place. Now, this is a movie that I actually had a ticket for just before the whole quarantine thing started, because obviously A Quiet Place 2 was just about to come out, and I actually had a seat booked for a double showing of them the week quarantine started, so obviously the showing never actually happened because the cinemas all closed. But anyway, this film is a post-apocalyptic kind of movie where the world has been invaded by weird alien monsters that are completely blind, but they hear really well, and they've got these great big claws on their arms, so if you make pretty much any noise or speak or anything like that, they can hear you about a mile away and they just run up and splat you with big claws. And it's all about how the Some Good News guy, John Krasinski, and his real-life wife, Mary Poppins, play a mum and dad of a family who've survived. And the reason they survive is because they've got a deaf daughter, so they all know sign language. And they make this life where they have very strict rules, and they make paths with sand so that they can walk quietly around barefoot, and they never ever speak out loud. And the movie shows how they survived during this pretty dangerous time. And it's kind of a bit like that Netflix movie Bird Box, you know, the one that came out about a year ago with Sandra Bullock. That was one where you couldn't look at aliens or you died. And it was a bit like some other films with similar ideas, like there's a movie called Don't Breathe, which has a kind of similar concept, and there's another movie that came out shortly after this called The Silence, which has almost exactly the same premise and I think kind of rips this off. But I've not seen either of those two, so I can't say exactly if that's true or not, but that's what I've heard. But this is kind of an old horror movie idea, you know, don't make a noise or the beast is going to get you. But A Quiet Place is kind of fun. It does have moments of seeming a bit silly, but it's more about the characters and trying to tell a story almost entirely without dialogue than being an airtight concept. And yeah, I mean, it does have some amazing design choices, most especially like the sound editing, because like the film is very, very quiet to the point where you can practically hear a pin drop and you can hear everyone breathing and moving even slightly. But I'm only going to give it 3 out of 5. And that's because the film is kind of full of holes. And as fun as it is, it's really daft. Although I did enjoy it, and I will definitely be checking out the sequel, A Quiet Place 2, when it comes out after everything blows over and the world goes back to normal again. But for now, yeah, I'd check this one out if you feel like it and you fancy just a bit of daft, fun alien monster movie. Next up was a low-budget horror movie called The Visit. Now this is quite an interesting one, because it's a movie by M. Night Shyamalan, and you probably know him as the guy who made The Sixth Sense, and he's done loads of movies since then, some great, kind of like the Unbreakable trilogy, which I absolutely loved, and some that are pretty terrible, like After Earth and the Last Airbender film adaptation. Yeah, they're really bad. But apparently for fun, and maybe to prove to the studios that he could still make cheap, great movies and not just waste millions, looking at you, After Earth, but he made this wee found footage style film about a couple of kids who got sent to stay for a week with their estranged grandparents while their mum goes off on a proper booze cruise. But the older one of the two kids wants to use this opportunity to make a documentary, so she films the whole thing, and that's the explanation for the whole thing being on camera. But strange things start to happen, and the grandparents start acting a wee bit off, and at night the grandma starts walking around and occasionally vomiting and scratching the walls and the doors. And the whole movie turns into a curious mystery where you're not really sure for most of the film if it's the old folks being a bit senile, and some of it's played where you can't work out if what's going on is just understandable effects of old age and maybe dementia and bad memory and stuff like that, and the kids not really being old enough to really understand or empathise with it, or if there's actually something slightly strange going on. But everything's kept just weird enough to be unsettling. And I'm not going to spoil it, but it is an M. Night Shyamalan movie, so you have to expect that there's going to be a twist in there somewhere. In any case, it's not his best movie. It's not his worst movie, certainly. I mean, it's probably a happy 3 out of 5. Keeps you guessing. It doesn't stay out its welcome. It's not that long. And it pokes kind of fun at his own style of filmmaking a few times. So yeah, it's not too bad. The Visit's an okay film. But of course, as you know, I do like to mix things up and step away occasionally from the horror films and things, because to be honest, it feels increasingly like that's all I'm watching, especially going by the films that have been on these videos recently. Wow. Anyway, I did watch another thing this month, and that was a thriller called The Interpreter. And this was an interesting one because this story was about Nicole Kidman playing a South African-born interpreter at the United Nations. And after overhearing someone plotting to murder a visiting African warlord, she gets Sean Penn put on the case, and he's the Secret Service agent in charge of protecting her and investigating the threat. And it's kind of a pretty solid political thriller as the agents chase down conspirators while trying to protect her, and there's loads of subplots and twists, and the two main characters slowly sort of finding out about who each other are with kind of wariness and apprehension, and they've both got secrets and things going on in the background. And also totally props that this is a movie which is not about a romance. We've got a male and female leads, but that's not what this is about, because early on we find out that Sean Penn is actually back at work only a couple of weeks after his wife tragically died. So he's not romantically interested in Kidman, as much as he's just trying to connect with another person after suffering a terrible loss. And yeah, the film has a couple of wee contrived moments and a couple of bits where the logic is a bit goofy, but all round it's pretty much a great film, which isn't surprising as it's also the last film that Sidney Pollack made before he died. You know, the guy who directed stuff like Tootsie and Out of Africa and produced dozens of other fantastic films. So yeah, 4 out of 5 for this one. Good for an evening when you just want something a wee bit thinky and a little bit of action, but not a huge amount, but a little bit more than just a basic run-of-the-mill daft film. The next film that I saw was a Friday night film one, and that was the old Stephen King adaptation, The Dead Zone. Now, this is actually a film I'd never gotten around to watching, but obviously I'd heard of it, and I'd seen the old Saturday Night Live sketch where Christopher Walken plays a trivial psychic. But in the proper film, he's a teacher who's had a terrible car crash and then wakes up a couple of years later out of a coma, and he now has the ability to tell if something bad's going to happen to someone if he touches their hand. So he keeps trying to make people avoid the problems, all the while getting lonelier and sad that his old fiancée is now remarried and has a kid, and his powers end up making him into a bit of a minor kooky celebrity. And obviously something bigger is going to come into the story because Martin Sheen's hanging around in the background as a cameo as a guy who's trying to get into political office. And I've got to be honest, I really enjoyed this film. Sure, it's a little bit dated, and sure, Christopher Walken gives some really nice touches in this film as this teacher with a broken heart. And there are actually some classic moments. So I'll forgive the goofiness, which to be honest is kind of normal for Stephen King and also kind of normal for David Cronenberg who directed it. But I'm going to give this a big 4 out of 5 and say, check it out, it's good fun. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty much a classic of its time and one of the better Stephen King adaptations I've seen. A less well-known movie is the next one I saw, which is Lady Vengeance. Now, a little bit of background on Lady Vengeance. It's actually the third part of a trilogy of movies called the Vengeance Trilogy, made by director Chan-Woo Park, all of which are themed about the idea of vengeance, funnily enough. And although they are a trilogy, they're not a trilogy in that sense that they're not actually the same characters or connected. They're just thematically connected. And the one of the trilogy most people have actually heard of is Oldboy, which is a really, really good movie. So much so that, although the original is really, really well respected, Spike Lee made an American remake of it a few years back with the people who played Thanos and Scarlet Witch from the Marvel movies in them. And he also did the movie Stoker, which I haven't actually seen yet, but it gets an awful lot of praise. And he made The Handmaiden, which came out a couple of years back. And I have seen that, and it's an absolutely amazing movie. The thing is, though, Korean cinema is kind of bonkers by Western standards, which, if you've seen last year's Oscar-winning movie Parasite, then you'll know how weird they can be. And director Park is definitely singing off the same hymn sheet as the Parasite director Bong Joon-ho, known as Director Bong. See, that's an interesting thing about Korean cinema. The director is usually referred to as director, and then whatever their name is as a sign of respect. Anyway, this film is all about Lee Geum-ja, who's a young woman who's sent to prison for the abduction, ransoming, and the eventual murder of this little boy. But it turns out that she didn't do it. And all the years that she's been in prison, she's actually been planning her revenge on the real killer. And the film's kind of about how she goes about it. But, this being a Korean film, in true Korean cinema style, it's not that simple and things get very complicated and take kind of weird turns. And I really enjoyed this, and compared to other Korean films, it's maybe more complicated and the narrative isn't quite as clear and straightforward as others. So, I mean, I definitely, if you're new to all this, I'd recommend you watch something like Old Boy or Parasite, or even the really bizarre Murakami and Faulkner-inspired movie Burning, which is also very good, to get an idea of how Korean cinema kind of flows. But in any case, I would totally still give this a 4 out of 5, and I'd say this is a definite recommendation to check out this film and get into a bit of a Korean movie vibe if you fancy. It's well worth the effort. A film that's nowhere near as good as that previous one, though, is Lockout. And this is a movie that I missed at the cinema when it came out, and wow, this is not a good film. It's got a decent cast, and the concept is solid in theory, because it's a movie about the president's daughter visiting a brand new space prison, and then something goes wrong and the prisoners break out and they have to send in a wisecracking criminal to rescue her. And this film is basically just the old Kurt Russell movie Escape from LA crossed with the Taken movies. I mean, even down to having the same girl who played the daughter in the Taken movies in it. And it's got Guy Pearce, and it's got the Irish guy off Preacher in it, and he's playing a Scottish psychopath. And when I said it's a bit like Escape from LA, I mean literally, because the makers of this film got sued by the makers of Escape from LA, and they lost. So there's that. And you can tell that an awful lot of this was shot on a green screen and pretty much on the cheap. The script is really paper thin, and it was obviously churned out over a weekend, which is surprising because it's written by Luc Besson, who should know better. I mean, you'd know Luc Besson movies because he made The Fifth Element and Leon and The Messenger and The Family and stuff like that. But as well as all that, he has a habit of churning out really, really bad action movie scripts. But anyway, everyone on this is kind of just picking up a check, and there are a few laughs and there's a couple of decent fight scenes, but this is a 2 out of 5 film, and I can already feel the specifics of the story fading out of my memory because it's not memorable. So honestly, I probably wouldn't waste my time on this one, just to be honest. Next up was a sort of military film. It wasn't a war film, but it was a military one, which was released in America as Kilo 2 Bravo. Which kind of makes sense because there's a history of stories like Bravo 20, which is the one about the SAS guys getting into bother in the first Iraq War, or Zero Dark 30, which was all about the kill mission on Osama bin Laden. But in the UK, they released this movie as Kajaki, the true story. And that's because it refers to the Kajaki Dam, which is in the Helmand province of Afghanistan. And it's all about a company of 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiments, or 3-Para as they're known. And they're up guarding on top of this mountain, and they have to pop down into part of the valley to investigate some potential Taliban bad guys up to no good. Only when they get there, one of them stands on a landmine, and most of the rest head down to help, and then they realise that they're actually in a valley full of mines, and they're basically trapped because they don't know a safe way back out again. And then with several of them getting injured, and no easy way to actually extricate everybody from the situation. And it's an absolutely cracking film, and it's got some really great and believable performances, especially from David Elliott, who plays Mark Wright, the corporal in charge of the situation, and Mark Stanley, who you might remember as Gren from Game of Thrones, and he plays the company medic, Tug. And it's a really tense film. And it's funny because, and this is an old one, there's a scene in one of my favourite old war movies called Kelly's Heroes, where the company ends up going into a minefield, and there's about 10 minutes of that movie, and it's really scary and tense the first time you see it, because you don't know what's going to happen, how many people are going to step on mines, if they're going to get away alright, if they're going to get away before the Germans arrive. And Kajaki is basically that exact same premise, but for over an hour of a film, and it's really unsettling, and it's kind of sad as well, because, I mean, this is a true story, these are all real people, and this is what really happened to them. And complete credit to the filmmakers for going that extra mile of realism, not just making the injuries gory and stuff like that from the mine blast, because they're really horrible to look at, but also in the way that everybody just talks to each other. I mean, there's loads of like kind of squaddy jargon like getting bandied about, and the film never tries to explain any of it because it's not important to understand it. You just have to understand that they know what it means, and it makes it just feel that little bit more real. And beyond that, all you care about is whether or not these people survive and get out of this valley back alive again. And this might not be a film for everybody. I mean, it starts off a wee bit slow, but I think it's definitely a 4 out of 5 movie just because of the ratcheting tension and the real sense of concern you have for all these people. So yeah, not one for the squeamish, but an important story nonetheless. Now, in a slightly different tack, let me tell you about a movie called Bad Taste. Now, you might well have heard of Peter Jackson, who made all the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings films, and he's the guy who basically put New Zealand on the map film-wise. Well, he obviously started somewhere, and the first film that he ever made was a complete zero-budget movie that he shot with his friends over 4 years or something like that, basically at the weekend using just home-bought bits and bobs, and actually had to re-record all of the sound on a tape deck afterwards because they didn't actually know how to do sound. They didn't know how to record it, you know, they're total amateur hour. But what they made is a charmingly silly kind of load of nonsense movie as Jackson and all his pals just run around trying to stop an alien invasion in like a wee backwards town in New Zealand. And a lot of it ends up just being like silly gory deaths and lots of complete chaos and anarchy. And really, this is only a 2 out of 5 film. It's a B movie, and it's one that I watched because I wanted to see how the guy who made so many amazing movies that I love started out. And it turns out that he started out making something kind of along the lines of Bocas. Only Peter Jackson actually has talent. And while Bad Taste was a low-budget offering that led Peter Jackson to become this lovey-darling of the Kiwi film industry, as I said, in Scotland we don't really have that. But Similarly, I watched a movie that was a low-budget first-time film from a guy called Laurie Buster, and this is called Lord of Tears, although apparently in some places it's been known as The Owl Man. And funny story here, this film is actually more famous for a viral video they made of the monster from the movie, giving people frights when they wandered by in an old abandoned hospital. I mean, that says kind of a lot about the film and about people on the internet. But yeah, the film itself is about James, and he's a guy whose mum has just died and left him a big estate house up in the Highlands. And when he goes up to visit it, he ends up befriending Evie, and she's this young, cute American girl who works on the estate. But every night he has nightmares about this creepy owl man and other weird things going on. And it's a pretty good effort considering that the people involved mostly hadn't done anything else, and despite that, it's only an 80-minute movie, and it's really got enough plot to fill maybe half an hour at best, and huge chunks of the film are just James and Evie wandering around talking with pretty low amounts of chemistry, and neither one of them is acting like a real human being would. And the scary stuff's kind of thrown at you right from the start in very jarring cuts and edits that actually lessen the impact when you see the monster later on, because you've already seen it from the beginning. And there's a real sense of filler and padding into the story, and it's clearly obvious that the people making the film realised that Alexandra Holm, who plays the main wifey in it, was the most accomplished actor on set, and so they end up spending most of the film shooting as much of her as possible, in fact, giggling and dancing around the set, even to the point when she literally spends about 5 minutes just dancing around the set, and you're really not entirely sure what the point of it is. All it adds to the movie is minutes. But like I said, I mean, this is a 2 out of 5, and it's the first thing made by these people, and apparently they've done another bunch of films since then, so maybe I'll check some of those out. They might well be better. But to top things off for August, I did actually see a pretty decent horror movie this month, and that was the recently released Russian movie called Sputnik, which is all about a 1980s cosmonaut who comes back to Earth after his capsule gets attacked by something in space just before they re-enter the world. And then a big military colonel type drags in this top psychologist who's known for breaking the rules, and he gets her to have a look at what's happening. And it turns out there's like a weird thing living inside the astronaut, something alien and strange. And the film basically from then on turns into a weird Russian amalgamation of a lot of things you've seen before. Like, it's very similar to the recent movie Arrival, but also it reminded me a lot of Ex Machina. And there's plot stuff that seems very similar to the Species movies back from the 90s. But all in all, it's kind of a solid thriller. As we watch this doctor, Tatiana, try to reason with the cosmonaut and the military, all the while trying to figure out if this alien life form is dangerous and if it can be communicated with, or even if it can be removed safely and separated from the guy without killing him. And I'd give it a pretty solid 3 out of 5. It's a fun film, and the CGI in it's fantastic, and it was really well shot. And although some of the plot is a little bit simple, very, very Russian in a lot of ways, it was still a good film, so I kind of enjoyed it. So yeah, recommendation. It's better than a lot of the stuff I've watched this month. And normally I would give you a recommendation of a TV show I've watched, but I've seen so much this month that I think actually I'll leave that for a separate video. But in the meantime, let me just remind you that obviously you can follow me on Twitter, you can join the Facebook page, and you can even join my Patreon if you really want. But till next time, I've been Ian, and these have been my grumpy opinions. And a special thanks to everybody listening, and especially my patrons, and most especially to Michelle Forbes and Judith Coloma, my top tier patrons. Thank you everybody. Everybody stay safe. Cheerio.